Continue in our Romans study here. Last week we spent a good deal of time on the righteousness of God, kind of an intro to the letter, and then that major theme, the fulfillment of Yahweh's promises to his people Israel. And then we got a foot in the door in chapter 1, verse 18, which I've entitled here on the lesson, Man's Sin and God's Wrath. And that's probably a good title for the class today, will be the wrath of God. Everybody's favorite topic. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
You just did.
To the righteousness of God thing.
Oh, sure, yeah.
What do you think, and this is the position of some scholars,
Sure.
that Paul may have intended both meanings at the same time? A righteousness regarding God's righteous character as well as a righteousness that he gives. And they're basing it on the idea that in the ancient world, a lot of times they do use double meaning concepts
Sure.
to give emphasis and so on. Not really tracking one way, one reason it weasels out of having to go one way or the other, I guess. But I do find it intriguing, though, the idea that there's a double meaning intended.
So the question, on the righteousness of God, whether it could have perhaps both meanings.
Yes.
Yahweh's fulfillment of his promises to his people Israel, and also the doctrine of imputation. So what I would say about that is of course possible. I don't think there's any way to show that Paul didn't mean it. So I would just say that's certainly a possibility.
Well, it is the position that's taken up in the ESV Study Bible.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me, just because within Protestant circles, we come to Romans with an already pre-packaged set of dogmas. Yeah. So my only hesitancy about that would be that, on the one hand, there's no way to disprove it. On the other hand, there's no real way to prove it. And I can understand how people who read the letter differently would just kind of grimace at, using that as an occasion to just gratuitously assume Paul is saying what everybody's already decided he must say. So I don't like taking that approach, even if or especially if it agrees with my already, with a dogmatic position I already hold. But there's no way to disprove it. And maybe, who knows, there might be something later on in the letter that could, if it could lend weight to that, then an argument could be, you could probably establish an argument to that effect. So that's interesting.
It seems to me that he does use it in both ways later in the letter.
Well, and maybe when that comes up, we'll take a look at it.
Okay, you can scrap that.
Yeah. I'm not going to dismiss it. I'll just say it's possible.
I don't mean scrap it.
No.
Leave it behind and go on.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. We can revisit that.
I think Douglas moved except.
I think he does, yeah.
That's the commentary I'm fact-checking you with. Douglas.
Yeah. Oh, I wouldn't.
Just so you know.
I didn't know that per se, but that wouldn't surprise me. That that would be a position that could be taken, that would be taken. So no way to discount it. If that's what Paul meant, he obviously hadn't been to Rome before. His audience couldn't have possibly known that is what he was getting at, though he could have intended that. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. Today, beginning in chapter 1, verse 18, I think, before we pull some of these verses apart, I will just read from the ESV, chapter 18 of verse 1, all the way to the end of the chapter. and then come back to these, because I do think we have to kind of get a whole picture of this section before we pull it apart. So, we picked up on this a little bit last week, chapter 1, verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." And that's really what we were looking at last week. And so this week we're going to pick up on chapter 19, but I will, as I said, read all the way through. "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds, and animals, and creeping things. Therefore," and we have kind of three sections here, consequences of man's rejection of God in three parts. "God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." Okay, that's the first one. Second, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error." That's the second. "And third, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind, to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them." Okay. So there's Paul's cheerful indictment of sin. And we see that the wrath of God is being revealed as a present tense verb. We mentioned that last week. So this is not a judgment that's going to happen at the end of time in the great day of judgment. This for Paul is something that is palpably visible now. And the reason why God is wrathful, he begins here, is because he claims God has shown himself to man. So there is an accountability structure in Paul's way of talking. You can't hold people accountable for things that they're ignorant of. You can hold people accountable for things that they know. And I think I said last week, and I always joke, that's why kids, by the time they're 2 or 3, are already learning how to not know anything. Because as soon as you don't know something, you're not responsible for it. You know, if I'm teaching a class and the assignment is due on Monday, all of a sudden nobody knew. Oh, I didn't know. I didn't know there was a test. I didn't know it was due. I did not know, as I told Becky this week, that the leftovers in the fridge were yours. That's why I ate them. I didn't know. Did I know? Well. So here we come to this statement, Romans chapter 1, verse 19 to 20, which is a very, very famous statement of what sometimes theologians will call general revelation. Now, that phrase is not found in the Bible, but the idea is that God has revealed himself, generally speaking, to everyone somehow through creation. And so that would be true whether one has a Bible or not. That would be true whether one is in India or China or America, wherever one is, in the ancient world, the medieval world, the modern, prehistory, whatever time one wants to say, all human beings, and Paul's language is what can be known about God is plain to them. So he doesn't say God reveals everything about himself in nature, but he reveals some things that can be known. God has shown it to them. And this is Paul's way of putting it. His invisible attributes, that's a paradox. You have seen his invisible attributes. That is a bit of a paradox when you think about it. As soon as he says these things are visible, so to speak, he says they reveal God's invisible attributes. What is that? His eternal power in divine nature have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so men are without excuse. So I got a little footnote on general revelation here. Let me stop, though, and see if there's any comments about it up to that point, because theologians will go different directions from there in terms of what they think has been revealed and how people have access to it. I mention here, what are the evidences of creation that testify to the Creator? I say in pre-philosophical antiquity, these would have been experiential. What I'm saying there is, it's very easy for us to forget that the philosophical and the scientific frame of mind develops not until 6th century Greece. Most people prior to that, what Paul would call barbarians, if they have a knowledge of God that is revealed in creation, it's not going to be through philosophical reasoning. It's going to be experiential. And that's important to bear in mind because even in modern religious circles, apologetics are almost done entirely in a philosophical or rational way. But that can't possibly be what Paul probably has in mind here. Because then general revelation would just be for the Greek. It would not be for the barbarian. And there's some good books written on this subject. Rudolf Otto wrote one called The Idea of the Holy. But it agrees appreciably with what Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, writes about in some of his dialogues. The experience of what C.S. Lewis calls the numinous, or the supernatural, or a feeling of awe. The kinds of things that Seneca said created awe in people were things like mountaintops, or groves, or caves, or places where people had a powerful feeling of a presence that they couldn't quite make out. And those, incidentally, are the places where you'll find altars and temples built. Ancient peoples built altars and temples all over the place, but they built them specifically, Seneca observes, in caves, on mountaintops, in groves, in places that evoked in man a sense of awe or a sense of a divine presence. And that's a little tricky, because that doesn't amount to a philosophical proof. But it does amount to a subjective experience of the divine. So I mentioned that first. The second here, an intuitive awareness of one's conscience is the voice of a moral lawgiver. That's a second pre-philosophical point of access. Man has an idea that he ought to behave in a certain way. Different civilizations differ about some of their moral laws, but there's a large swath of agreement. No civilization I've ever studied had said that you should murder your neighbor, or that you should steal his property, or that you should take his wife, or that you should flee in battle. all civilizations have had certain virtues and certain moral codes that, broadly speaking, agree with one another. And you can find that true as far east as India and China, as far west as Greece and Rome. Now, they may differ on certain other moral issues, the way people always do, but the conscience is another thing. And then I talk a little bit after the rise of philosophy, more inferential arguments were developed which moved away from polytheism toward monotheism. So here I mention Anaxagoras. Plato is more well known. Certainly people have heard of Aristotle. But the experiential basis for belief was not discarded, just given a more rational cast. I do mention Seneca here. In the Middle Ages, arguments for God's existence were taken up by patristics like Origen and St. Augustine, and then scholastics like St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas. After the Enlightenment, rationalists like Descartes and Leibniz, empiricists like John Locke, George Berkeley, all argue in a rational way for God's existence. So there is a 5-minute class on apologetics. Now, let's see if there's any question or comments on that, but there it is, all in a section there. Because Paul mentions it, and then he sweeps right by it. God has revealed himself to man. Man is accountable. And it's breathtaking because, of course, in the modern world, people wrestle mightily with the question of God's existence. And Paul leapfrogs past it like, well, that's, easy enough. Yeah.
Just a connection. In the book of Acts, there are a couple of sermons where Paul preaches to non-Jews. One is in Lystra, and one is, I think, in Iconium, and the other is in Athens. But anyway, in any case, in both places, he kind of says the same sort of thing. He says, God has created the world, and he has created humans and given them life and food so that they may seek after the Lord. And if possible, might even find him. Which is not exactly the way he says it here in Romans, but it's very much on the same kind of page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's...
Luke is faithfully reproducing Paul's sermons.
Yeah, Paul does engage in, Acts is probably a good example in the Athenian sermon of some, what we would call natural theology. Now, it's a little bit different in the ancient world because the ancient world is incurably religious. Atheism just isn't even really a thing in antiquity. People might believe in one God or another God or different kinds of gods, but they generally believe in the divinity of the powers that lie back of the universe. The only rare exception would be people like Epicurus. But Epicureanism is a uniquely Greek kind of rational dismissal of the idea of God or gods. And probably on our own, that has made the question of God's existence more fraught than it was in Paul's time. I imagine if Paul wrote Romans today, he might hover on this question a little bit more than he does right here. But in his current context, this is not a big issue for his audience. That there are gods is clear. Nearly all of the ancient religions find people burdened under the weight of either guilt for having transgressed something, for feeling that the gods are angry with them. So one thing Paul does have as an advantage in Romans, he can assume, for the most part, that his audience know that there are gods or a god, and that they know that they're in trouble. That's pretty much a widespread ancient outlook. So then the question is, well, what does the wrath of God look like? We have this phrase, God gave them over. Verse 24. Well, before I get on to that, let's reiterate here in verse 21. Although they knew God, okay, the idea is that they know that God exists. They didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him, but became futile in their thinking. Futility is probably equivalent to what we were talking about in the Man's Search for Meaning class. Their thinking became pointless. Their lives became meaningless. Man has a deep desire for purpose in life, but now without God they can find no purpose. Everything becomes meaningless. Their foolish hearts were darkened, so they fell into the grip of dark animal passions. They have the ability, an advantage over the animal, to pursue higher things. But once you say that life is meaningless, then the animal passions take over, because there's really nothing else to motivate you to move forward in life. That's why if you're sitting at home and watching television and life seems meaningless, before you know it, you're raiding the fridge. Because what else? The only thing left to motivate you is this sort of low animal desires, and then next thing you know, that's the only thing getting you off the couch. Well, let's see what's in the fridge. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God. And here it comes to what, for Paul, being a Pharisee and a Jew, would be the main point. Images made to look like mortal man, birds, animals, creeping things, but basically the worship of creaturely things, idolatry. So all that's left is this world and the tangible things of this world. So then we come to verse 24, therefore. But let me stop there. So we have idolatry, meaninglessness, reduction to animal passion. Any thought about that? I think that's pretty straightforward. That, again, is material that could take up a whole class, but Paul moves fairly quickly past that. He's moving quick in his letter to the Romans. Now, therefore, these are sort of the present tense punishments, the wrath of God that is now happening because man has forsaken this life of religious seeking. He gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for lie and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So the first expression of God's wrath is in man's body. The dishonoring of the body. Now this, and he uses the word lust here, so this is a tricky passage because I think in our current Western context, we think of the body, and then the word lust is used, we're almost immediately going to think of something sexual. Now, I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here. We'll recall that in the Old Testament particularly, lust is a word that is used a lot of times in connection with idolatry. Yahweh condemns the people Israel for lusting after other gods. And we see that contextually speaking, Paul uses also the language of impurity, which is also connected with idolatry. And he says, too, here, they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. So in this first expression, as I put it in the notes here, the body is degraded. Instead of fulfilling its high destiny to serve as the temple of God. That's That's page 12, top of page 12. The body is degraded to the status of a mere object, an instrument to be used in the pursuit of lesser things. So that's what the degrading of the body means. If we connect what Paul's saying here with what he says in Corinthians, the human body has the highest, noblest purpose of any created thing on earth. Do you not know that your bodies are temples? In other words, God is to indwell the human body. So that is a very, very high purpose to ascribe to the human body. But if the agency of the human body is used to pursue merely earthly things, then that is a degradation of the body. The body is not really fulfilling the function and the purpose for which it was created. So, in the next two, I'll just give us the three and see if there's any question. Paul's going to deal with the body, he's going to deal with the passions, he's going to deal with the mind. The wrath of God expresses itself in our bodies, in our passions, and then in our minds. And then the mind specifically is the idea of, you could say, what it is we strive toward. Ancient writers think of the mind in a less intellectual way, more in the way Aristotle does, the place where we set our goals. What we set our eyes upon would be the Old Testament way of putting it. So the mind is the repository of our goals. Then our passions, the feelings that we have as we strive toward those goals. And then our bodies, the agency with which we carry it out. So we have to kind of get our fingers around a little bit of the anthropology that Paul has embedded in his letter here, which is a little bit different than a sort of Western intellectualist. You have goals, you have passions, you have the body that is the agent that carries them out. So he just kind of goes through all three of those. Now, in the next section, he comes to the passions. He does have something to say about human sexuality here. And so in our own time, this has become a hotly debated topic. God gave them over, therefore, to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. Men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, committing shameless acts with men. And this is an interesting phrase, receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. So the distortion of sexuality is, at least in the language of this passion, its own punishment. And that would be true whether the people involved are happy with the situation or not. Because the issue here is that the creaturely role of male and female joining together and collaborating with one another in bringing forth life is now frustrated. Because in Paul's understanding here, sex isn't just about pleasure. It's about the fulfillment of a creaturely design. The creation of family, the production of children, and the fulfillment of our vocation as life givers and life receivers. Husband, father, mother, wife, child. Now, however, people are given over to unnatural passions which thwart them in the fulfillment of their creaturely role, just as the debasement of their bodies has thwarted them in the fulfillment of their spiritual destiny. So you could go a lot of different directions with that particular passage. But Paul does seem to be saying here that sexual deviance is a punishment not laid on this or that person individually, but on mankind as such. It's a punishment for his forsaking of his divine vocation. And it is its own punishment because it thwarts man in the fulfillment of his creaturely vocation. And he doesn't say anything here about whether or not people are happy or not. And that's probably important because that is personal fulfillment and happiness have become such a central part of our way of thinking about human meaning that we have to kind of adjust our thinking to get into Paul's head when he discusses these issues in these letters. So I'll see if there's any question or comment about that. Yeah. No, Doug, you had your hand up first. All right, Dad.
It doesn't matter.
Oh, yeah.
I would say a couple of things. One is Paul is writing to the Romans within the first century culture in which homosexuality, lesbianism, all that sort of thing were very much part of the culture. So he's not spinning, a web or something that doesn't really count. He's talking about a culture that was probably pretty much as given to this sort of thing as we find in the 21st century culture.
Definitely.
Acceptable motive. That there were some laws in the Roman, among Romans about that didn't forbid it, but it controlled certain aspects of it. But nonetheless, it was very common.
Particularly among the Greeks. Any of you who've studied classical culture know that in the Greek civilization, sexual expression was every bit as free as it is in contemporary America. This is not a non-issue. And so Paul doesn't look at that and get angry at it in this passage so much as he looks at it and he, I don't know if compassion is the right word. That's the word we'd like to use today, but he sees it as part of the visible expression of God's wrath. This is what happens when God leaves man to his own devices and says, have it your way, and this is what happens. You had a comment earlier.
A couple of things. First of all, I wanted to ask you, and maybe Travis can chime in on this.
Oh, yeah.
We're reading the first part of being given over. Do you think that I have an idolatry problem with my watch collection?
You do, yeah. So, yes.
Can you go over receiving in themselves again? Is that the actual act, the actual being enveloped in that, is actually the penalty for their being given over? Is that what you said? I didn't listen on it.
Receiving in themselves.
Like in Ezekiel. Maybe you didn't make it.
There's a passage, there's several in the Torah and then in the Psalms that probably in different language echo this idea. One of the Psalms says, their glory is their shame. The idea is that mankind glories boldly in the very things that from a religious perspective he should be ashamed of and should better maybe hide away. So the idea is that in themselves, in their own passions, we can think of, it's an awful thing to have a passion that you don't get to have satisfied. But Paul seems to be taking that a step back and saying, just having certain passions is itself can itself be a punishment and a burden. And I suppose we all know that. In some way, shape, or form, everybody knows that. We all have passions that we would prefer to be without, that we don't think are very healthy. It's not that we're just frustrated that we don't get our passions fulfilled, but we wish that we didn't have them sometimes, right? And so that's what he's saying. You receive in your own self, in your own passion, is a kind of punishment of God letting man go his own way. And that's, I said earlier, that's not something that every individual is just individually responsible for. We are part of a whole human race. We are born with warped passions, frail bodies, and all kinds of difficulties before we've even reached the age of 2. And those passions will be different from person to person. Paul, I think, zeroes in on homosexuality here because, thinking as a Jew, male and female, he created them. This passion in particular kind of showcases mankind at his most opposite of the Creator that he's been talking about just in the previous verses. The divine order of things here, if anywhere, for Paul, man is doing the exact opposite of what he was clearly created to do. Yeah.
Also, I think he's pointing out that perversion gives birth to even greater perversion. Perversion is progressive.
Yeah.
And that's part of the meaning of God gives them over, is that, at least it would seem to me, that not only do they give themselves to perversion, but he allows them to continue on that line so their perversion becomes greater and greater.
Sure.
Chad, that's what I've heard for, not that that makes it right, but I've heard it a lot. But I've heard that since I was a Christian, which was 1980. That that's the key to the passage, is that it's progressive.
Perversion is progressive.
At least in this passage, the way it's
Yeah. Well, you can see, therefore God gave them over, and then there's a progression. As man forsakes God, his body is degraded, his passions become twisted, and you can see as he moves into the third area here, it's sort of a garden of vices. There's just vice after vice after vice. So, and now that enters into the mind. The body is degraded, the passions are perverted, and the mind is fixed on goals which are unworthy of man. So, now he says, probably the one to catch them all, which is what we're talking about, they invent ways of doing evil. So that's another way of saying it's progressive. Here's a new form of evil that mankind had not yet hit upon. And we see that even in our own time with the sexual, particularly in the area of sexuality, there's always, we're running out of new thresholds to cross, right? Are there any logical possibilities left? Now, if there are, they will be explored.
I think there's logical possibilities left, and unfortunately, I think they will.
Well, one of for people who are not sympathetic with the LGBTQ camp, one of the arguments, of course, is that as we try to create new rights for new and increasingly unusual people groups, they're coming into conflict with one another. There's so many on the table that they cannot consistently be maintained. And so now the women's rights movement is coming into conflict with the fact that now we have trans people who are, are they women or are they men? If they are women, then what does it mean to be a woman? And what is a woman's right when a man can say that he's a woman? It's becoming ridiculous for a lot of people.
Do they get to use?
What's that?
Which bathroom do they get to use?
Which bathroom do they get to use? Which sports team can they play on? Does the government have a moral responsibility to facilitate surgical adaptation of their bodies to, so right now in America, that this sort of inventing new ways, the progressiveness of it, that's what we were talking about, I think, is evident, yeah.
In attempting to justify these behaviors, they tend to develop new vocabularies for certain things which softens their perversion. It makes them sound a little more acceptable. So, that would be true. If you go back 50 years, the word gay just meant happy.
Sure.
You know, I mean, we sing
Back in those
Christmas.
1920s movies, that's what it meant.
Yeah.
Well, when they made the Yuletide gay,
Or,
didn't mean you say that these days and everybody starts chuckling. Yeah.
Today, there's a new one, relatively new. I think it's called, Travis can help me maybe, MAP, minor attracted person.
Yes, that's
Oh.
coming about, yeah.
Okay.
That's a way of
Very dangerous thing.
changing vocabulary, but in a way that takes some of the sting out of.
Say pedophilia or something like that. Well, and there's a counter, in some of the sermons in the moralizing of the 19th, early 20th century, you could detect an attempt to make things more awful and harrowing than they were. There's always a tendency to either soften moral language or make moral language that much more ferocious. But you're right, that finagling with language is happening. So this passage in Paul is obviously a hot topic because a number of churches are wrestling with whether they want to be more accommodating to these lifestyles. I think the important thing, and then I'll move on to the next one here, is to bear in mind, though, that for Paul, this is a consequence of God's judgment. And they have received in themselves the punishment for their forsaking of God. That will be important because as Christians try to navigate this subject, we're caught between churches that are justly concerned about hate language and about mistreatment of people who wrestle with these issues, and then may become so accommodating that they just go along with culture, which I don't think you can do. So that is a real issue. And a big part of it, too, is that we increasingly separate happiness and fulfillment of passion from role or function. As long as a person is happy, as they see it, we think, well, there can't be anything wrong with it. That, of course, is not correct. So, tricky. These others here, they did not see fit to acknowledge God. God gave them up to a debased mind. So their passions are distorted, their bodies are distorted, their minds are distorted. And here he mentions, of course, well, just read it one last time here. Evil is a kind of catch-all, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossip, slander, hatred of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, there it is, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. So back to where Paul started, you say, well, the wrath of God, present tense, is being revealed. Someone might say, well, how do you know that? What do you see in front of you that tells you that God's wrath is brought against man? And Paul's big three are the agency of his body is devoted entirely to earthly things. His passions are perverted, distorted. And his mind is filled with all kinds of wicked ideas and things. And I think Paul fully expects that his audience will receive this as obviously true. Now, he'll talk a little bit in the next section about judgment. But let me stop and see if there's any more comment or question about this particular particular passage.
Pastor Chad, I hope you consider yourself my pastor. I should admit to you right now that I'm what I refer to as a CAP.
CAB.
CAP. Chronometer attractive person. That's me.
Yeah?
Share that with everyone now. Come out of the closet.
You like watches.
I thought that'd be a lot funnier than it turned out to be. But comedy isn't always pretty. It's not always pretty.
Watch it. You didn't have mine.
Oh, let me see. Let me see. Oh.
Paul's list certainly sounds pretty apropos for the 21st century.
Well, and it can be, I think probably as an overall, the important thing here is the legacy of Paul's Jewish heritage here. God is creator. The body is intended to be a temple for God's Spirit. The passions are intended to facilitate life, bringing forth of new life, familial life. The mind is a place where faith, hope, love, the virtues of justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. And instead of all those wonderful things, man has, I think we just use the language of fallen. Man has fallen from the dignity that he was called to. So then he's going to come to the subject of judgment, which we can only touch on here briefly. I usually get through lessons in a couple days, but these Romans lessons, I'm not moving too quick. So let's take a quick look at it, though. In chapter 2, verse 1 will lead us into where we'll pick up next week. You have no excuse, O men, every one of you who judges. For in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. And I'll continue a little bit further here. And we know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. So God is in a position to judge because God is pure. And I think here Paul does not mean judgment in the sense of past laws. He says, well, because we use the word judgment in a very kind of loose way in our contemporary culture. Obviously, societies are going to pass laws, and they're going to enforce laws. To that extent, they're going to make judgments. Families will make judgments about members of the family. People will make judgments within social relationships with other people. The point here is the kind of judgment that leads to condemnation. That is what Paul is saying we don't have a right. So maybe, get hold of Paul's meaning here, we could probably use the word condemn in place of the word judgment. Does that make sense? He's speaking of judgment in the sense of condemnation. So, every one of you who condemns. Every one of you who condemns. Condemnation, what does that mean? It means like when I'm walking down the road and I see a building, like I see in Pontiac, and I say, this thing is worthless, so let's bulldoze it to the ground. We call a building like that condemned. You basically judge that the thing has failed and that it is ripe for the fire. It's ready to be destroyed. But the question is, well, who has the right to say that? Now, man can make judgments of all different sorts of things, but he can't judge in the sense of condemn, because he himself is under condemnation. And as we'll see, that's going to be Paul's main point here. Now, I want to kind of lead off with that, because we can't wade in too deep. We're toward the end of class. But that's become a big issue in our churches and in our society at large because of the way we use the word judgment. we sometimes miss Paul's meaning here. Let me see if there's any question or comment about that. I make judgments every time I grade a student's paper. If I give an A, that's a judgment. If I give a B, that's a judgment. If I give a C, that's a judgment. So he's not talking about judgment in the broad, open-ended kind of way of making judgments at all. Condemnation. And we're going to get into a little tricky subject next week because Paul's going to talk about Judgment Day. And here again, he's going to say some things that push against again, he used the language of law and works and reward and punishment. And so we'll have to see what he says there, because as we get further and further into the lesson, we'll have to see what is the relationship between grace and works. Grace and works. But that's all I have time for today, so I'm going to close out there unless there's any final comment. If I took too long on today's class, don't judge me. Judge not, lest you be judged.
Well, we will all be judged, so I'm free to judge.
All right, thank you.